I'm old enough to remember this. In 1958, Khrushchev visited the United States, and they had a friendly chat. Eisenhower was getting kind of old, and he did not go to Moscow the next year. So instead, Eisenhower sent his vice president, Richard Nixon. Well, Richard Nixon went to Moscow to visit Khrushchev, and your book shows a picture of it on page 777. And they got involved in what's called the famous kitchen debate. Now, with all due respect to Nixon, all of you know that eventually Nixon became president, and he disgraced himself. But this fiasco he had here was not his fault. President Nixon carried with him an American kitchen where he told the Russian leader, now this is the way a typical American housewife lives. Well, all right, I want to back up a bit. Keep in mind the Soviet Union had a shortage of housing. The Soviet Union people were so short on housing that they had to double 2 or 3 families to a house. Or maybe have a 5-room apartment where they had 3 families living in one apartment, and they all had to share the same kitchen, the same bathroom. In the meantime, American homes in those days seldom had 2 families living in one house. I mean, each household had 1 family. Now today, I mean, our economy, believe it or not, has declined to where kids are living with their parents longer and longer. But in those days, in some ways, our economy was more prosperous than now. But anyway, President Nixon took along this kitchen, and in this kitchen, he showed off an automatic dishwasher and a dish dryer, which he said is in almost every American home. He said every American home has, he showed off a refrigerator, which he said, now almost every American housewife has a refrigerator. He showed off pop-up toasters, and even a clothes washer and a clothes dryer, and soap powder. He said, now our housewives will wash their clothes in this automatic clothes washer and then dry them in this dryer. And at some point, Khrushchev just blew up and had a tirade of cuss words at Nixon that Nixon said my interpreter blushed to try to interpret them for me. Just a complete blow up, and Nixon said, hey, you know, what did I say? What did I do to the man? I'll tell you what he said to him. He just simply pointed out that our people are living better than your people, and you don't like it. Eventually, the 2 men apologized. Actually, Nixon had little to apologize for. He had not blasted back. I mean, after all, he was only the vice president, and the Soviet Union was the leader, and he was trying to be on friendly terms. But the 2 men more or less made up. Nixon was later to write a book called 6 Crises, and he included this as one of his crises. The big kitchen debate where that Nikita Khrushchev had blown up at Nixon on account of Nixon trying to tell us how good we had it over in this country. All right. In 1961, the United States elected President John F. Kennedy after Eisenhower had fulfilled his 8 years and couldn't run again. The Republicans ran Richard Nixon, and the Democrats ran John Kennedy. And folk, there have been many a person who have said that Richard Nixon actually won the election of 1960, but Mr. Kennedy's father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., did some vote tampering. Have any of you heard this outside the class that swung the election in favor of his son Kennedy? Maybe a good thing for Nixon, because Nixon was to get to live about, oh, let's see, he got to live till 1994. He lived 34 years after the election. Kennedy only lived 2 years after the election. Anyway, Kennedy officially won the election, became president. About the time, though, that the election was occurring, Fidel Castro took over Cuba. The Castro brothers have run Cuba for this, 1959 to the present time. Fidel Castro became old, and he finally turned it over to his younger brother, Raul. And Raul Castro, again, has run it from, let's see, the year was 2008 when Fidel finally gave up power. But Castro was to run Cuba from 1959, Fidel to 2008. So the Castro brothers have run Cuba. Again, another country fell the communist. Now I want to state this, folks. I mean, it was looked bad. I mean, I was a child growing up, and the year I was born, China fell the communist with more than 1 billion people. Shortly after that, well, just before I was born, Eastern Europe fell to communist. The year I was born, China fell. Shortly after that, North Korea went to communist. Then Cuba went communist. Then Vietnam went communist. And then nobody went communist after that. But it looked for a while like communism was going to take over the world. A bunch of us were scared. But the biggest crisis, I mean, I've talked about how that there was one crisis after the biggest crisis of all was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Essentially, after Castro took over Cuba, Cuba is only 90 miles from Florida. After Castro took over Cuba, the United States began flying U-2 reconnaissance planes over Cuba. Now, the U-2 is now obsolete, but if any of you are familiar with the U-2 airplane had a huge, huge wingspan, which meant it could go up 60,000 feet. That's pretty high. I mean, your commercial airliners don't go any higher than about 35,000 feet. Your small jet aircraft, called corporate executive jets, they'll fly 45 or 50,000 feet. They can carry maybe 20 or 30 people at most, sometimes only 10 persons. But 60,000 feet, 70,000 feet, that was pretty high in those days. But anyway, a U-2 airplane was taking pictures of Cuba and noticed missile-like shapes, which they sent back and reported to Washington. And Kennedy began to take a closer look and decided, yes, Castro's government has missiles in Cuba. Well, President Kennedy said these missiles have got to go. We can't tolerate it. The Soviets replied, well, you have your missiles in Turkey. What's wrong with you having your missiles are closer to our country than ours are to yours? Kennedy said, well, we've had our missiles there all along. You've known about these, but you secretly put these missiles at Cuba, and we are not going to allow them. They've got to go. And it looked like a war was about to break out. Kennedy made a speech where he said, I'm going to put a blockade around Cuba, and I'm going to examine every Soviet ship that comes into Cuba and make sure none of them are carrying missiles. And we're going to keep on until we have gotten all the missiles that are in Cuba out. The Soviet reply was hot and heavy, and it looked like a war might happen. Now, war didn't happen. Now, I want to say this in favor of Mr. Kennedy. To me, the Cuban Missile Crisis was his finest hour, where he did, all right. President John F. Kennedy was a louse. He did a lot of bad stuff in his lifetime. But the one thing he did here that almost makes up and atones for every bad thing he did, he saved the world from a nuclear war at his time. And that almost makes up for all the bad he ever did. He was the right man at the right place at the right time. He decided, I mean, his generals were saying, you need to invade Cuba. And Nixon once said, if I had been president in 1962, I would have invaded Cuba. For all we know, the man might have. Kennedy negotiated, and in this process of negotiating, his brother, I mean, we had two presidents, their names were John and Robert. John Kennedy was officially the president's brother, Robert was his attorney general. But Robert negotiated a secret treaty whereby we agreed we would pull our missiles out of Turkey secretly. Now, we found out about this later, but we pulled our missiles out of Turkey, and in turn, they agreed to pull their missiles out of Cuba. And war was averted. And you might say, well, do I mean I favor us making a secret agreement to not telling the American people? Our leaders do sometimes have to do what they have to do. Yes, if the American people had known that we were secretly going to pull our missiles out of Turkey, the American people might have protested. As it was, the crisis passed, and life in America went on. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a hotline installed, but the hotline was a telephone between the White House and the Kremlin being where the Soviet premier lived and where the czars had lived before him. And supposedly if another crisis like this came up, we'd get on the phone and talk things through. Our president, we'd get on the phone with the Russian premier. The hotline was almost never used for reality. It was, the technicians would test it to make sure it worked, but it almost never was used. And some people said that's the way it should be. but there was a hotline set up. Eventually the relationship led toward what we call detente, where we tried to maintain some kind of a friendly relationship with the Soviet Union. We did not at this time grant them most favored trade nation status because we didn't feel like they were deserving of that. We weren't to do that till later. And I say that tongue-in-cheek because now we're taking away the trade privileges that we had once given. Hey folk, it's only been about 3 weeks ago, I was looking at a ham part that was available from the Soviet Union, or from Russia, cheaper than what the Americans were selling the same part for. And I almost bought it. I said, I'm going to wait. I waited, and this ham part on eBay was taken off eBay. I don't know if it was because of this crisis that's involved right now or not, but anyway, it was taken and never put back on. And I wound up ordering the same part, and paying a few more dollars, but ordering the same part from the American company, rather than order it from the Russian company, because, again, the Russian company is no longer selling in the United States. I don't know if that's part of the economic sanctions we're putting on or not. There have been several movies made about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that one, Missiles October, is one I happened to see one time. I want to say this about movies that feature President John F. Kennedy. I've never seen an actor who really, I can say, really looked like him. Now, in Adolf Hitler, I mean, if you put the right mustache, you can make a lot of men look like Hitler. Abraham Lincoln, put the right beard on him, and you can make a lot of men look like Lincoln. Try to make a man look like Kennedy, he had no whiskers. And it's somewhat difficult. All right. Again, the United States was helped out in the Cold War by the fact that the Chinese and the Russians got into a dispute, and one of the issues was when Stalin died, Khrushchev became looked on as leader of the communist world. Well, Mao said, hey, I'm next in line, I should be leader of the communist world. I mean, after all, I've fought for, besides, China has more people in the Soviet Union. The Soviets said, no, we look on Khrushchev as being our leader, not you. That was part of the issue. There were other issues too. The Chinese wanted the Soviet Union to get involved in a war with the United States and to help out more in Korea and Vietnam. And the Soviets, in effect, said, we can't afford that. You are closer to both Vietnam and Korea than we are. And again, if you look on the map, you can see China has a border with both Vietnam and Korea. You're closer, you help them out, but we're not going to get involved. We just don't have the equipment or the money to send that far away. In fact, Khrushchev, once he was half quoting the Bible, he said, blessed is the man who talketh war and knoweth not what he is talking about. Basically referring to Mao talking war. Soviet Union began to remove its advisors from China. By 1961, the two sides were out openly hostile to each other. And then your book talks about the Second Vietnam War. Now, the first Vietnam War was Vietnam versus France, which Vietnam won. The Second Indochina War was Vietnam versus the United States, which, as you know, the United States lost. All right. I've got to move fast. I plan to finish up this chapter, chapter 26, next time, and I'll have more to say about the Vietnam War, the fall of Saigon, Richard Nixon's opening up trade with China, Brezhnev era, Ronald Reagan, the fall of the Soviet Union, and then go on to communism. Now, a lot of what's in chapter 26 overlaps chapter 27.